Hi, this is Pastor John Hall with Let's Talk Timeline with Pastor John Hall. Now, this is the fourth podcast of four podcasts when we're taking a big look at how timelines are put together and what people do to change them. And today is the big one about the prophetic ones. Like, how do we look into the future? What are people saying, or what are they people are doing when they have timelines and they say, well, this was true in the past, so now this is going to be true in the future. Now, we have to keep the pedal to the metal on this because we want to get through it. I want to be clear, have clarity. So I got to have a certain pace, but we don't want to be here all day. So it's going to be about 10 minutes in review and about 30 to 40 minutes going through all the things that we're going to be looking at. I think you'll be interested, and I think it'll be very, very helpful. So let's get started on Let's Talk Timeline podcast number 4. So now in review, we're going to do 3 charts, and we're going to put 3 charts in review, and these are the main charts. And we're going to go fairly quickly through them. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail, but for those who have never seen it, you can see, and whatever is confusing to you, you can go back in the first 3 podcasts and get detailed. For those who know about it, then they can be a little bit of review. But the first thing on the first column there are what are the events in the Bible that the Bible uses to count the years from Adam down to Jesus, and these are what they are. Okay, the next 2 columns are the 61 verses that are attached to those events. So if you want to look through all the verses yourself and see how that this goes from Adam down to Jesus, you got them right there. It's not, you don't have to go through chapters and chapters. Now, the one about Ezekiel, you probably need to go back into the second podcast and look at that and understand how that 430 years, we'll take a quick look at that maybe, but there are the verses that go with those events. And when you add all those verses up, first of all, you have the exact number of years for each thing. Adam to Abram is 2008, and then Abram being born to the time he's going into Canaan is 74 and on down. So those are the years that the Bible is talking about in the time spans. And you put that together and add them up, and then you end up with 3,960 years, and this 3960 is attached to, I believe, Jesus' baptism in April 30 AD. So then you start there and you work backwards and you find out that according to this timeline, without any gaps, creation would have been, or at least the fall of Adam would have been, the year 3930. Now, I know that sounds really, really early for a lot of people. You know, Usher has 4004 and people practically have a heart attack there. But what I'm saying is, you go down through the verses and you will see that that is what the Bible is saying, unless you put gaps in. So we're going to move on. Here's the next most important chart. Now, this chart is important because it's Ptolemy's king list. Claudius Ptolemy lived between 100 and 175 AD. He was a genius, a Leonardo da Vinci of his day. He did books and he did astronomy, he made inventions, he did atlases, he sent people out and got population. He come back and put it in there. He was really famous. In fact, you can look him and get all kinds of information. Well, on the back of one of his books, on one page, he had this list of kings and the number of years that they supposedly ruled. And so what happened was people used this in a continuous, uninterrupted, with no mistakes timeline. And then from the 2nd century all the way down to the time that Usher does his stories, and I mean not fictional stories, I mean puts in his timeline and the stories that were going with his timeline, you see that they were using this King's List absolutely perfectly the way it's listed. So if you look on the bottom left-hand side, you got Nabonidus, which is Nebuchadnezzar, 605 BC. So if you start on the yellow side and go all the way back and add up all the years with all those kings, you're going to end up with 605 BC. Cyrus in the light blue one, 539 BC. Alexander the Great in the light green one, 333 BC. What is this saying? This is saying that people think that the timeline from Nebuchadnezzar down to Jesus is somehow out there, been verified by all kinds of different things, and everybody's got exactly how it is, and there's no question. And here we find out that that timeline is totally based on this king list and this king list alone. So Augustus, you see that on the top yellow one? Well, it says 30 BC, but now the historians are saying, no, 30 BC isn't correct. It should be 27 BC, now that they really checked it out, which means it's 3 years off. Well, technically, then they should move the year for Nebuchadnezzar from 605 to 602, and Cyrus from 539 to 536. Well, are they going to do that? No, they're not going to do that because they don't realize it's connected. This is very important because not only was that a mistake, but in the light blue one, if you look there, Darius the First, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes the First, well, my goodness. Ezra chapter 4 says that those three kings are the same person with three different names, but in Ptolemy's list, it's three different kings with three different reigns. And this causes a tremendous amount of confusion and makes a big difference when people are trying to chart the 70 weeks of Daniel. So let's look at all the big numbers, and we're going to come back to that Ezra thing at some point here. But the big numbers, what is this? Okay, so you see that on the left, these are all the events that we have from Adam down to Jesus, actually Adam down to 70 AD, because 70 AD is the most absolutely certain day in human history. Everybody agrees that 70 AD is 70 AD and is exactly 70 AD, and Jerusalem was destroyed on that date. So that's a really big, huge, pivotal point in terms of all timelines. Now, we have three people in the boxing ring on this issue. You have, I believe, 61 verses there without any gaps. Then you have James Ussher, who put his together in the 1600s. And then you have Dr. John Whitcomb, who produced his timelines in the 1960s. He was a co-author with Henry Morris on the Genesis flood, which, started the whole creation, resurgence of that. And he's a very, very conservative person, and he put together these timelines, and every date that you see in your Bible reference books or in your notes in your Bible, I mean, maybe every once in a while, but almost all of them are from the timeline, and we'll go through and see his timeline and how it may differ from the other two. So let's start out and see. I'm going to do the big picture here. Here are all the years from Adam down to 70 AD. And notice in the red, first of all, Whitcomb has gaps. So he came up, and other people, conservative archaeologists, believe that there's gaps in the chronology between Shem, Noah's son, and Abraham's father, Terah. And because of those gaps, they cannot date the flood, and they cannot date creation. And conservative Christian, Bible-believing, profoundly, trusting the Bible in every way, they are still believing there's gaps, not as a mistake, but just as a reality. And because of that, you can't date the flood, you can't date creation, but you can begin dating things with Abraham's father, Terah. That's where they start. But after that, from then on down, you see that it's pretty much the same. The 645 there, now we got on the right side here, all the verses that, talk about the differences. So what happened is Wickham missed this. It is a mistake, I believe. It's very easy to show. Galatians 3:17 says there were 430 years between Abraham and Exodus, not 645. I explained that whole thing in the previous podcast. You'll have to look that up. So he's got 215 extra years there. Then you move down and see the next red ones. That is where Usher, during the time of the kings, he has 398. I think it should be 406. That's only 8 years. But then Wickham, what he did is he was thinking that the Assyrian king list was also very accurate and that he needed to reconcile the Bible with that king list. Now, he was not trying to change anything in the Bible, change any of the numbers in the Bible. So he just felt like he needed to get those two to, connect. And sometimes he disagreed with the Assyrian king list, but he came up then eventually with 52 less years than I believe it should have. And then you move down, notice the next red ones, and this is during the time from Cyrus or Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, down to Jesus. And they used Ptolemy's king list, the one we showed before. And when they did that, everybody's going to come up with the same exact number of years, which is 569, coming down to 30 AD. Now, the interesting thing about this is James Ussher did this one thing. I just want to bring this up because a lot of people don't know about this and they wonder, where's this information coming from? So James Ussher followed Ptolemy's king list all the way down to 26 AD, where he put the baptism. And then, he, it was around 26, 27. Then he put in 33 AD as his death date because Dionysius, who actually created a AD-BC calendar, that's where he had it. And he thought, well, he's got to be correct, but Ptolemy's got to be correct. So then what he did is he actually has Jesus dying on the cross at the age of 36 and argues that Jesus had his ministry lasted for 6 years. Well, nobody believes this. I mean, nobody believes this. Nobody says that Jesus was 36 and that he had 6 years. Everybody knows it was about 3.5, not even a question. But Ussher did, and you take those extra 3 years off, and you end up with 4,074 total years. And so this is why then you have Ussher saying it's 4004 BC, and why other people like Wickham say, well, we don't have a date for the fall. There might be well, God created it this time, but at least for Adam and the fall, human history. So 4004, I think it's 3930. I believe what the Bible is saying, if you don't put any gaps in, is 3930. And the interesting thing about it, if with Ussher, if Whitcomb would just had gotten in some of these other things, wouldn't use Ptolemy, wouldn't use the Assyrian list, would have got the number of years in Exodus in Egypt correct, he would have come up with the same number as I did, but he put gaps in. So really, that's the main difference between all of them in the big overall big numbers. And that's really, really huge. So let's get into today. That's the review. If you want to know more information about it, that's okay. We go back to the other podcasts. Today, we're looking at some other things that I think are very interesting. People probably are more interested in this than even, when did King Saul live and those kind of things. Probably not as interested in that. But the questions are, is the Hebrew timeline correct? The one that everybody talks about. And people say, the year, the Jewish calendar, the Jewish biblical calendar is in 5790 will be our 2030 AD. People talk about this all the time, 2030, 5790. And then they'll say, well, this is a Sabbath year because the Jewish calendar says it's a Sabbath year. This is a year of Jubilee because the Jewish calendar says it's a timeline, says it's a year of Jubilee. Well, I want to look at that very, very specifically because I think that is not realistic to be able to say that, and I'm going to show you exactly what we're talking about. Can people know which years are Sabbath years? Can people know which years are the years of Jubilee? We're going to look at that. How do people make when they have prophetic timelines and they're trying to come up with a certain date, a certain place, how do they come up with, you know, a situation where they need to add or subtract a year, or they need to come up with a certain number? And, how do you maybe change that and feel legitimately that you should do that and need to do that? So we're going to talk about that. But let's get back to the Hebrew timeline. So, first of all, I just want to show you this in case you don't know. Most people wouldn't know. Here's the book, and it's called The Sequence of Events in the Old Testament. Now, this book here is the one I used, and this guy, he was unbelievable, Elazar Shulman. And in this book, he explains everything about the timeline for the Hebrews and why it is, in their mind, going to be the year 5790 in 2030 AD. Everything you could possibly know. So maybe there's other resources, but he is extremely detailed. And he explains every year and why they chart it the way they did. So I went through that. And let's just go over some of the details of the Hebrew timeline so you know, maybe you are already aware of this, but the timeline starts with creation as year number 1. And that's why it's called AM, because it's a Latin word for the phrase year of the world. So year of the world 1, or it's been 1,000 years since the beginning of the world. That's where it comes from. Latin word that stands for year of the world. Now, in the Jewish Hebrew timeline, of course, there's no gaps. I sure didn't put in gaps, but most everybody now in the contemporary Christian movement puts gaps in the genealogy. And so when you have no gaps, then their way of counting it up is 5790 is 2030. And we're going to take a look at that and show you exactly how those numbers come up. Now, just another quick thing. I feel like a little bit of a sidetrack here, but you just got to know this. The Hebrew calendar is a solar lunar calendar. What does that mean? That means they kind of look at the moon and its cycles and the sun and its cycles. And so it cycles around every 19 years. And that's why Easter keeps moving every year. What years, what's the date for Easter this year? Why is that true? Because our calendar is a solar calendar, and they are using a solar lunar calendar. Now, in the big picture, like if it's 75 years, it's 75 years. If it's 5 years, it's 5 years. It's just saying, as you're progressing through it, some of the days of the year are going to be slightly different until you come back around after 19-year cycle. Now, the thing that's a little bit complicated, but you got to know this because this is important. The creation calendar, in other words, when God started the human history with creating Adam, in our calendar, that would be September. Now, it's now September, October because of the flood, but we just simply say, just think about it as September. Okay, it's called the creation calendar. It starts in September, and it goes from September to August, and that is how you talk about the Sabbath years, because they begin in September. And the years of Jubilee begin in September. It's like the ball dropping in September. That's the new year, right? Now, labor contracts and the freedom from debt, that's the same thing. Now, the religious calendar, God adds it at the first Passover in Exodus chapter 12. And what he does, basically, he just steps up and says, hey, really, it's March, April on the calendar, but just make it simply, it's March. And basically he said, hey, I know you just got done dropping the ball in Times Square. You went over to New York and did that and came back to Egypt. I know that you did that in September, but we're going to do it again now in March. And now your new year, the way you're going to count everything is the new year starts in March. So that kind of moved the dropping of the ball from September to March. It kind of immediately moved it up 6 months. So what is important here is that after the Passover, during the rest of the Old Testament, if you see a month and it's not named, it just says the first month, the third month, the fourth month, you start with March and you go March, April, May, June. And if it's the 12th month, then it would be like February. Okay, so that's the way to think about it. And the problem is when you're charting the calendar and you're trying to pick a certain date for a very specific, now there's only a couple times in the overall timeline, which may be a little confusing. It all works out in the end, but you realize that you can kind of like, okay, you know, what year am I in? Maybe I need to add a year, maybe I need to subtract a year. Because we have January through December, that's our calendar, right? But then the Hebrew people have March through February for the months, but then they got September through August. And so when does the year become a new year if it's June? Because it's become a new year for the religious calendar, but not for the creation calendar. And that can be confusing, but I just needed to let you know that. It really, really doesn't affect much at all. But if you're doing timelines and you're trying to get the exact number of years, you got to be aware of that. Now, the prophetic timelines, most people are obviously interested in the Bible timelines for what they might indicate in the future more than charting what happened in the past. I mean, really, does people really care about the time, you know, the exact BC date for the Exodus, or, you know, Nebuchadnezzar 605, what does it, you know, matter? You know, Cyrus, doesn't really matter. But they are interested in it in terms of the future. And, well, what does this mean for the future? And that's what this whole podcast is talking about. That's what we're talking about today. So I'm going to suggest that if you're going to do something about it and say, well, the past was this time, so therefore the future now in 2020s, you know, in 2025 and 2030 and 2035, therefore such and such something should happen. So the big issue here is that your timeline, if you're going to do that, has to be absolutely correct. Now, it cannot be used to project the future if anything is wrong with the way you did your timeline. You can't have a mistake. So let's talk about some prophetic timeline patterns that people all know about. There's two of them, and we're going to talk about both of them today pretty extensively. The 1 day is 1,000 years. Almost everybody knows that, right? 1 day is 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like 1 day. And then, of course, the Sabbath year and year of Jubilee cycles. And this is really big because so many people are saying, well, this is a Sabbath year, and there's been so many Sabbath years to Exodus. I'm going to show you why. That's a very difficult statement to make, to say, I got this figured out. I'm going to show you all the reasons why. Let's start, though, with prophetic timelines often used. A day is 1,000 years. I'm going to show you this. We're not going to show you everything in the Bible because there's a whole bunch of ones, but we're going to show you the most important ones, the most important verses. Okay, first of all, the two biggest verses are Psalm chapter 94, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by. 2 Peter, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. Those are the two big ones, right? Now, you're going to tie that together with the church age, because Jesus talked about the time of the Gentiles. And he started first alluding to this in Luke 21, just before he died. He said, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time the Gentiles are fulfilled. And the apostles and the disciples must be going, what are you talking about? What do you mean the time of the Gentiles? We're supposed to be taking them over. Like, what do you mean the time of the Gentiles? We're supposed to be taking over the kingdom. What are you talking about? And then Paul, he clarifies a lot in Ephesians chapter 3, but he says in Romans chapter 11, Israel has experienced a hardening until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. So now, we find out God said, well, I was going down here. We had the 483 years, the 69 years of 7 sevens. And I just didn't mention to you, we're going to take a little bit of a break and we're going to have the church age and we're going to have a couple of thousand years. So this becomes really important. This is what most of the prophetic timelines are all about. Now, realize that Revelation, for example, chapter 1, Revelation 22, look at these statements that Jesus had John write down that Jesus said. His coming is soon to take place. The time is near, and I'm coming soon. That's what he told John the apostle when he was writing the book of Revelation. Well, it's been over 1,900 years. I mean, that's not very soon unless you're going to talk about it as being 2 days as God experienced. Now it's not much time at all. It's just 2 days. So this is very important, and this is where we make a big deal about this. And so 6,000 years, since creation, 2,000 years basically from Adam to Abram, 2,000 years basically from Abram to destroying the temple, and now we got the church age for approximately 2,000. This is a pretty big deal, right? So let's look at some very powerful verses. Hosea is one, and then in Luke is another one. 2 days equals 2,000 years. Now look what Hosea prophetically says. Now he was looking, obviously, or God was telling him something about the future. And he says, he has torn us to pieces. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will restore us. Now, Hosea probably didn't understand what that was talking about. Now we know the most probable interpretation of that is that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and it's going to be about 2,000 years since that date, and then it'll be revived. They will come back together. All right, well, this is pretty big. Now, Luke chapter 13, you got to write this one down. Like, you need it in your Bible where this is the most important verse in the New Testament. Jesus speaks this. You got to get this. Jesus first speaks in this verses that we're going to read symbolically of a day as 1,000 years. And he's going to talk about it in terms of the church age. And then, though, he's going to talk about the literal days, and this is really contrasting and is very exciting, actually. So let's look at this passage. What was happening? It was almost time for Jesus to pass away. I mean, not to die, not pass away, to die on the cross. And the Pharisees come to him, and they said, leave this place. Herod wants to kill you. Well, of course, they were just trying to scare him off. And this is what Jesus said, though. He replied, go tell that fox. Now, it's kind of interesting. Wow. Go tell that fox, Herod. Now, look what he says. I will drive out demons and heal people. Sounds like church ministries, right? Today and tomorrow, and on the third day, I will reach my goal. That's almost like Hosea. The first day, the second day, and on the third day, we will be revived. On the third day, I will reach my goal. Now, this has to be talking about 2 days, 2,000 years, because look what he says next. In any case, I must keep going today and tomorrow and the next day, for surely no prophet can die outside of Jerusalem. So now he's talking about his crucifixion coming down the road here in about a week or two. And he's saying, I'm giving you a prophetic word here today and tomorrow, and on the third day. That's really 2,000 years. You don't even really understand there's going to be a church age, and you think that we're all going to be, the Romans are going to be defeated by the Jews right here. Not too much. Maybe, this summer, but that's not what's going to happen. We're going to have 2,000 years where demons are cast out, people are healed. Wow. But notice, in any case, today and tomorrow. So obviously a big contrast and really important one. Now, there's a lot of different examples in the New Testament of 2 days and 2 years of the church age. I'll just give you this one. You may not have even seen this. John chapter 1:35. Jesus starts his ministry after he comes back from being baptized and then being tempted. He comes back, and on day one of starting his ministry, he calls Andrew and Simon. Now, the next day, he calls Philip and Nathaniel. That's really it. One day, two. It's like, okay. And then notice what happens on John chapter 2, verse 1. On the third day, they attend the wedding in Cana, symbolic of the marriage feast of the Lamb found in Revelation 19:7. So there you go. Day one, day two on the third day. Hosea, day one, day two on the third day. Jesus and Luke. I'm going to cast out demons. Tomorrow, today, and tomorrow, and then on the third day. So you can see that this is a consistent, and you could see why people would say, oh, well, that has to mean something. It's got to mean something. It's so obvious here. So that is a little sidetrack. You need to know that, though, about the 1,000 years, because we're going to come back to that. So the Hebrew timeline says that 5790 is 2030. We're going to look at the Hebrew timeline. Let's just look at it. All right? It's not really going to take that much time at all, because I've already shown you different parts, and we're just going to show you where their differences are. Okay, the first one. Now this is almost funny about this, because people talk about this a lot, don't even know why they're saying this. So the Jewish timeline does not believe that Terah was 130 years old when Abram was born. They think he was 70 years old. Now, all the evangelical, because we have Acts chapter 7, verse 2-4, so we know that it's really 2008 when Terah had, it says he had, at 70 years old, he had Abram and his two brothers. Doesn't mean he had triplets that day. No, he didn't have triplets. It was just saying that's when he started having his children, and Abram was the most important one. Well, they think it's 1948. Now, how many times have you heard people say, oh, Israel became a nation in 1948, and Abram was born in 1948 years after Christ? No, he wasn't. That's a timeline the way the Hebrews have it. We don't believe that. So if you're a person who thinks that 1948 for Abram and 1948 for the bringing back the nation of Israel, it's just, it happens to turn out that way, but the BC, AD, and everything, it's not really, no, it doesn't really work, actually. The second one, and it's hard to explain, but at the end of the day, Galatians chapter 3 says there's 430 years from Abram to Exodus, and the Jewish people have 425. They have a big, long explanation about it, and if you want to look it up, you can. The important thing is they just have 5 fewer years. And then during the time of the kings, they're going through, and they didn't use Ezekiel's 430 years, and they're just adding up the kings, and they do a couple things. So they want a certain pattern to turn out. They want kind of like 850 years between this point and that point. And so then they end up with what I believe is 22 fewer years than they should have. Then after that, the big one is, and they know this, they talk about this, that they have way fewer years from Cyrus down to Jesus. 83 fewer years based on what I think it should be. But if you are, Usher, or you're a Whitcomb and other people, the total is 170 years if you're looking at the Bible verses alone. But Usher, if you're going to use the numbers, because he used Ptolemy, it's 244 fewer years. And if you're going to use the evangelical timeline and without gaps, okay, so just if you took Wickham and said, well, we're not going to put gaps in there like he does, but we're going to do everything else he says, well, you're going to end up with more than 412 years fewer in the Hebrew calendar. So this is the important thing. They're saying that in 2030 AD is year 5,790. And if you go down through there, it's exactly where this came from. Exactly. And they're saying then that creation and the fall happened in the year 3660 BC. 3660 BC is their date for creation. Now think about this. No one in the evangelical community charts the fall at 3660 BC. We don't do it. We don't believe that. We don't chart that. We don't do any of that. So just think about this. We are looking at 5790 as an important year. We're believing, oh, well, it's the Hebrew calendar. But we don't use that for ourselves. We don't believe it was 3660. So when people turn to the Hebrew timeline to make profound statements about prophetic things, and they don't even realize, they don't believe the years that the Hebrew people have on their timeline is even correct. I'm just bringing this up because we can say a lot of things. We just shouldn't say things that we shouldn't say. And one of them is to use the Hebrew calendar as if it's correct when in fact we don't believe the years as they chart them. Okay? So here is one of the bottom lines that we're going to jump into here. Prophetic timelines, and I've done a lot of research, thousands of hours actually, because I was interested in it. How many people are going to do this? Very few people are going to do this. Why spend so much time doing it? But I really liked it. And if you're into prophetic timelines, you spend a lot of time. So there's a few people out there that probably are listening to this, and you spent a whole bunch of time too, and you've gone through it, and you've written some books on it, and you got a website out there. And so I would like to make a statement. It would be great, and I wish we could, with confidence, say that prophetic timelines are meaningful if they start with Adam and try to come up with a pattern, or like 1,000 years, or if they start with Joshua and the Sabbath years and the time that they start and say, well, we know there were so many Sabbath years since Joshua, therefore this is what's going to happen in 2028 or 2030 or 2032. This is not really possible, and I'm going to show you why this is true. It's very difficult to say that. Now, I would like to make this statement because, first of all, I don't want to be totally negative here. I just want to be honest. But I think we could start with what we absolutely know for sure, like some point in time with Jesus' baptism or the day of Pentecost. We have those dates, and we're going to take a look at them specifically as we look at this and say, well, it's been 2,000 years since then. But when people go back, and they do it a lot, and they say there's so many years since Adam and so many years since the Sabbath with Joshua, here's the problems. Now, I would like to say, I think everybody is sincere. I don't think anybody's out there going, oh, I'm going to make a timeline and I want to make it really interesting so I can get a bunch of clicks and fool a bunch of people because I'm going to tell them things that I don't believe. This is not happening. I believe every person who comes up with a timeline in the Bible and then says, I think that because of that, this is what we should see in the future. They are sincere. They are diligent. They have looked into a lot of things. I don't think they've looked into Ptolemy's king list. I don't think they've looked into Wickham's mistake about number of years in Egypt and slavery. I don't think they've looked into the king years, with the Assyrian king list. And they need to do that. Maybe they did do that. But almost hardly anyone even knows why the years are the way they are, like 605 BC for Nebuchadnezzar. So starting with Adam or starting with Joshua, to target an exact future year in our, in the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, no, hardly anybody's going to the 2040s. Everybody's doing everything between now and 2030, right? And 2036. Let's be honest. That's what people are doing. But they're saying because of what the timeline says in Adam, because of what the time says in Joshua, therefore we can do that. Let's look at the problems here. First of all, you have to be 100% correct. You have to be absolutely correct. If you're going to say that a certain year in 2028, in 2030, in 2033, something's going to happen because of going all the way back to Adam, all the way back to Joshua, then you have to be 100% correct. You can't miss Terah's age for being 130, mark it in as 70 like the Hebrews do. You can't have Wickham's mistake of putting 645 years where it should only be 430. You can't try to reconcile the Assyrian king list with the Bible like Wickham did. I know who he is. I've talked to him on the phone. I mean, he's a part of the church I grew up with. I went to the same college where he was a professor at a seminary. I know this person. He is absolutely conservative, but he made a mistake, and he was absolutely conservative, but he believed that the Assyrian king list needed something that was a good thing and a good resource, as well as Ptolemy's king list. And you can't make the mistake that Usher did and that Wickham did and use Ptolemy's king list, because it's just flat out wrong. Now, you can't use the Hebrew years either. Like I showed, 170 years short, rounding it off, maybe 250 if you go with Usher, maybe 400 if you believe Wickham's timeline is correct. How can a timeline be 170 years short, minimum, and then use that to predict a specific year in the future? That's what I'm saying. So we have to be correct. Also, with the right date. So you have these different, when you're trying to put the two timelines together, the Old Testament coming down, now you have the BC dates with the ADC, where are you going to, put that connecting point in time? Well, you have Jesus' baptism and his crucifixion. Some people say he was baptized in 26. Some people believe he was, crucified in 30. Some people believe he was crucified in year 32. I think he was crucified in 33 because that's when Dionysius said it. And I think there's other reasons, because Tiberius Caesar, in Luke chapter 3, who in his 15th year, that was when Jesus was baptized, which was 30 AD. That's why I think. But you have to be correct, because if you're not correct, then you're going to be off 1 to 3 years. And if you're saying a certain specific year in the future, you can't be off by even 1 year. So let's look at the Sabbath and Jubilee. There's so many complicated things with the Sabbath years and Jubilee years. It's just unbelievable. So first of all, you have to make sure that you start, because there's a debate. The Jews went in, started conquering the land, 6 years war. Then they divided in the 7th year. They divided it up. Everybody got their inheritance. Was that a Sabbath year? The 7th year, most people think. I think it was the 7th year. But you know what? Some people think it's the 14th year. That the first Sabbath year wasn't to the 14th. And guess who they are? The Hebrew timeline. The Hebrew timeline says the Sabbath year, the first Sabbath year, is the 14th year after Canaan. Now, if your timeline says it's the 7th, and then you're going to say what the Hebrews are correct, and they start with the 14th, how could that be right? And then here's another big deal. And I explain this. It's not hard to understand once you are told what it is, but let's look at it. There's the 49-year cycle for the Sabbath and the 50-year cycle. Now, let's say you have two people riding in the car, going down the street, having a good time, because this is what is happening. They're going down, they're both in the front seat. Listen to music, windows are rolled down, feet are out the window, great time, right? So now they're going down here. Now, this is how it works. You're going down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you're going through 7 cycles, and now you're at your 49th year, and you're going to celebrate the year of Jubilee. What are you going to do? Well, the 49-year cycle says the first year of the next cycle is the same year as the year of Jubilee. But the 50-year cycle says, no, that's separate. That's its own individual one. And then starting the next year, we start over. So after the first cycle, the guy in the passenger seat, the 50-year cycle guy, he's now in the back seat. The next time, he's in the trunk. And the next time there's a cycle, he's not even in the car. So if you're going to use a 49-year cycle, and then the Hebrews use a 50-year cycle, and then you say that they all are coordinated, and that somehow we know that in 2030 it's a Sabbath year, a year of Jubilee, I don't see how that's possible. Now, I think the 49-year cycle can be shown as the correct one, because if you start with King Saul, this is a very few, I know hardly anybody knows this. If you start with King Saul, in his first year, he was out there plowing, and they come and they anoint him king. But you start that Sabbath and say that's a Sabbath year, which I think it was, and 70 Sabbath misses later, the next Sabbath year that they were supposed to celebrate, but they weren't, which would be the 71st, that was the beginning of the 70 years rest. So the first year when they picked King Saul and they wanted a king over them, they were officially getting rid of the Sabbaths. Now, here's another important thing. Well, the Hebrew timeline says no, 50-year cycle. I think 49 is correct. They think 50. And get this. Look in the Bible and see if you can find a year of Jubilee that's mentioned in the Bible as being celebrated. Not there. You can hardly, Sabbath years, you want to find it in such and such a year was the Sabbath year. King David was, it's his 21st year of reign, and there was a Sabbath year. Never see any of that. So the celebrations of the Sabbath years, and this for sure, no story in the Old Testament about the years of Jubilee are recorded as this is a year of Jubilee. Now you could say, oh, well, the Hebrew people know because they have extra information, but the Hebrew people, they're using a timeline that's not correct. So whatever information they have, they're going to tie it to an incorrect timeline. I'm not trying to be obnoxious. I'm just saying, hey, look, let's look at what we're looking at and make sure that we know what we're talking about, which is right, 49, 50. You can't be wrong here. You have to be right if you're going to use it. Now, the Sabbath year is a year deal. Now, the last dated event in the Bible is Jesus' baptism. So, let's think about this. Do the Sabbath years continue during the church age? Because it's like you come up to Jesus' baptism, and the last dated one is Caesar Tiberius, 15th year, and that's it. And the question is, does God see that as the end of counting the Sabbath years? And now in the church age, we don't have them anymore? Like they quit counting in God's mind? Do we really know that? Some say the Sabbath resumed in 1948 when Israel became a nation, partly because 1948 was when Abraham was born, which isn't correct. But other people say, no, that's not right. Other people say, some say it ended in 70 AD, and some of the 1948 people say that too. But it ended in 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed. Therefore, the Sabbath years began and resumed in 1967. Look, that's a huge difference. That's a big difference. Somebody's got to be correct, is it? Which one is it? And so if we're going to make statements that we're absolutely sure, 100%, that this is exactly right, I'm going to say you got a lot of hurdles to get over without making any bumps, without knocking any of them over. They can't even wiggle. When you get over that hurdle, it's got to be a clean shot. So here, given the number of different ways the Sabbath can be charted, I think any timeline, think about this, any timeline can be adjusted to support any future year as a Sabbath year or a year of Jubilee if you want to make it do that. Not purposely, not maliciously, but you can, you look at it, and you think, okay, this is going to use this and this and this, and you realize, well, am I going to put the Sabbath years during the church age? Well, maybe I shouldn't, maybe I should. Well, should they, and so all of a sudden, 2030, 22, 2035 or something like that. Now that's a year of Jubilee, therefore. I don't think that's possible. So let's look at a couple of other things. Ways to adjust the years. We're coming kind of to the end of this. Ways to adjust the years to make the timeline come to a given year. I'm going to just throw out a couple of them that I see. So when you see people do this, I'm saying, well, this is a little bit more, why are you doing that? A little bit more problematic. First of all, you can start at let's say you got everything and you're just off a little bit. You're off by 1 year. You're off by 2 years or 3 years. Well, start at a different day when the church begins. All of a sudden now I'm all in the camp of the people who believe that 32 AD is because 33 wasn't working out for me, or 30 wasn't working out for me. And so now I'm honestly, in my heart of hearts, trying to be honest about it. And I just realized that maybe I was wrong about that. I mean, people aren't trying to really be dishonest when they do this. But there's 30, 32, and 33. Isaac Newton thought it was 32. Count the years, 360 days from point A to B. Now, this is a very interesting thing. Notice that in Adam to Noah, the days are 360 days a year. We know that because when you look at how Noah counted the years, it's clear that he was thinking of them as 360 days per year. And we all know in Revelation, how does God talk about the rule of the Antichrist? 1,260 days. How many days were the Gentiles going to trample down, 1,260 days? How many days do the two witnesses witness? 1,260. That's 360 days a year. But during the middle of it, we got the solar year, which is 365.242. So what people can do is they go, well, between this point and that point, we're going to count 360 days a year. We're going to show one here in a minute. So this proves it. I proves it because there's a pattern. There's a pattern. My timeline, it has a pattern, and this proves that my time is correct. And I would like to suggest to you there's a lot of numbers that over time can add up to me a pattern. I'm going to show you two of them. So if you're a person doing the timeline, or you're looking at something and somebody's suggesting something, the person charting it, it seems to confirm their dates. And it's hard not to believe that, and I'll show you a perfect one. Here's a perfect one. Ptolemy's date for Ezra is 458 BC. Now, Wickham thought that Ptolemy's timeline was correct, but if it was, then Daniel couldn't use Cyrus. Cyrus had the decree, to rebuild everything. The angel comes to Daniel and says, from the time that you hear the decree to go out to rebuild Jerusalem until Jesus comes is 483 years. And so Daniel is going, yeah, I just heard that from Cyrus. Boy, this is really helpful. But then Wickham is going to come along and say, oh, no, that's not correct. When the angel came to talk to Daniel, he was saying, yeah, from the time you heard the decree, but actually, not the decree you're thinking about that Cyrus just gave that you just heard about. We're talking about one that's 85 years down the road, where Ezra gets a decree, and that's the one we're talking about. But then look what happened. Wickham looks it up, and then he goes and finds out that Ptolemy says year 26 AD is when Jesus was baptized, and that's when Jesus shows up. And it's exactly 483 years. How could that not be wrong? Now, let's look at another one. People use this. Robert Anderson. You've probably heard about this, but you've never known where it came from. So, Robert Anderson, 1841 to 1918. And he decided that he was going to chart Daniel's 483 years. Very, very famous guy. A lot of people quoted him, probably more in the past. I've heard it recently. People have quoted him, but here's what he came up with, and I think you'll recognize some of this. So first of all, he didn't say Ezra. He picked Nehemiah. But he had a little bit of problem because Nehemiah is 445 BC, and wow, that's not quite enough years, so what am I going to do with that? I'm looking for the right one. I don't think I'm trying to be dishonest, but Nehemiah is not a decree. It's the king giving him permission. So people say that are Ezra's camp, they go, oh, well, it can't be Nehemiah, it's not a decree. Okay, but let's look at what he did and what he came up with. So he said, where's the end date? He had to pick an end date. Well, he picked a very specific day. The day that Jesus came in, the triumphal entry, and he shows up riding on the donkey, and that's the day he picked. Now, he could have picked Jesus' baptism. He could have picked, but that's what he picked. Now, he could have picked year 32 AD, which he did because probably Isaac Newton, but 33 AD was very, very popular back in that time. Dionysius, 33 AD, that's what a lot of people believe. Ptolemy and him, Ptolemy's thing and the Dionysius thing. And then Isaac Newton came in. So he picked 32 AD. Now he starts March 14th of 445 BC. And what's interesting about that is Nehemiah talks about which month it was, but not which day. So he picked the day that worked for him to come up with what he needed to do. And then he realized, well, I still have too many days. So he started counting the years by prophetic years, as he called them, 360 days per year. And look what happened. He came up with 173,880 days. And guess what? It worked, because there are 483 prophetic years in his mind. From Nehemiah, if you start on March 14th, 445 BC, if you counted at 360 days per year, if you pick the triumphal entry on April 6th, 32 AD, you have exactly 173,880. And you could say, how could 173,880, it's got to be right. Well, the people from Ezra don't think so. So that's a pattern. And you could see why it would be very, 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 very convincing. Ahead a year, behind a year, call a year transitional. Add, subtract a year that way. So you need an extra year, you need to subtract a year, and then it turns out, well, then you just call a year a transitional year. Let's review this. Many timelines with many different years since Adam and Joshua. That's all there is to it. Many different ways to chart the Sabbath and Jubilee years, okay? 5 different dates you can use to connect the Old Testament and New Testament. 26, 27, 30, 32, 33 AD. And you could argue for any of those dates. So if you're going to use 1,000 years, it's a day and a day is 1,000, you're going to go from that. Then you have to pick the correct date. So which date are you going to pick? All right? So here's some reasonable conclusions. I do believe that God has a timeline from Adam to Judgment Day, and I think it's very specific, and it's going to show his sovereignty. It's going to show the fact he's in control of history. People live, people love, people have children, people die, and voila, right on time, so-and-so shows up, 15 generations later. I mean, that's the act of God. Who said, I got married because God told me so? And, this is when I had a child because that's when we had a child. It's exactly the way the Lord wants it to do, yet we have free will. It's amazing, amazing things. But when God shows us what it really is, I think it will have tremendous amount of meaning. It'll have tremendous amount of symbolic meaning. But we won't know that until we have all the information. Now, I think it's true the Sabbath years and years of Jubilee are also very meaningful. And when we actually know whether they went through the church age or didn't go through the church age, God will reveal that. And when he does, we'll see how the whole Sabbath year and the 70 years of rest and everything, and there's probably 70 years in the church age somewhere where we didn't realize and there was a rest. I don't know. God will show all kinds of things that we haven't even thought about, right? But, we don't have that information. However, we could, pick a New Testament event, and you could at least say this, 2,000 years from that point in some way. In other words, what can we do? Okay, so let's say we can't do Adam. Let's say we can't do Joshua. But we can say it's almost been 2,000 years in anybody's book. If you're 26, 27, 30, 32, 33, 2,000 years. Okay, so let's look at that. And now we're at least, kind of in the ballpark. We can maybe disagree with each other. It is interesting. Jesus, was he baptized in 26, 27, 30? I think he was baptized, in 30 because, and it could be an important date. It was the last date listed in the New Testament. So that's, that's really important. So you could pick a date like that. Now, people are going to disagree. So we still have disagreement here. You could pick the day of Pentecost. That would be reasonable, right? We're talking about the church age, so why not pick the year in which the church was actually started? But people are going to say, well, the church was actually started in 2030. And then Isaac Newton says, no, it was started in 2032. And Dionysius says, no, I charted it started in 2033. Well, if you're projecting out 2,000 years, well, then that's 2030. I mean, I'm sorry, really. that 30 AD, 32 AD, and 33 AD. 2,000 years later is 2030, 2032, 2033. You understood what I was trying to say. 2,000 years after those events, right? So Jesus' years from that point in some way, right? And here's another example. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So 2,000 years after that is 2070 AD. Does that have something? Well, I don't know. It might. So let's look at it. After 2 days, on the third day, says Hosea, says Luke 13, Jesus. What does that mean? What does that actually mean? After 2 days on the third day, it has a meaning. It has a meaning. It will fit with somewhere, somehow, and maybe soon. Maybe soon. If 2,000 years is connected to 2030, though, where are you going to really chart the Battle of Armageddon? Is it 7 years after 2030? Is it 3.5 years after 2030? So even if you had that right, we still have a little flexibility here as to how it's all going to like fit together at the end of the day, which I think we really won't know for sure until it happens, okay? So my final thought as we come to the end, let's say all that we can say about 1,000 years, about the Sabbath years, and about that. But let's not say any more than we can say. So I think the Bible is prophetic. I think the timelines are real. I think that if we had every correct date on every level, it is a pattern, and I think you can project out to the future to say, here's some real possibilities. Let's say that. Let's do that. Let's stick with that and look and see what happens. Let's see how it all plays out. Well, that's the end. For a podcast. It's been 2.5 hours, maybe more like 3 hours total between the four. I hope this was interesting. I think it was really exciting. There's not going to be any more podcasts. I mean, this isn't like subscribe. Please like, please share. But there's no place to subscribe to the timeline thing. I might put out another one that kind of like puts it all together in a very precise 30-minute thing. I went deep into each of those subjects each time, and you wouldn't be able to do that. So we'd have to, take different summary points for all four podcasts and kind of put them together. I'm really thinking that might be good. But please share, please like, and, donate if you'd like. The Ark Empowerment, put down there, Pastor John Hall. And we appreciate it a lot. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope it was a journey. I hope there's still somebody listening after the end of the fourth one. But I think there were some important things that were said, and I believe somebody is going to be happy that they watched it and really understand what's being said and benefit from it. God bless, and have a great day.